All right, week 14, how we doing? I'm actually doing this before the Thanksgiving holiday because that's when the schedule allows. But so whether you're watching this before or after, I hope the Thanksgiving is really great. I hope the rest is great. I hope you use the rest. I know the end of the semester, this is the part where everyone's tired, everyone's exhausted. So I just pray that you would use the time well. And yeah, let's get into what we have to talk about. And again, I hope you have a really great week of rest. I know I'm going to take advantage of mine. So anyway, we are coming down to the end. Check your syllabus for due dates. There's papers, things of that nature starting to happen. Be on the lookout for announcements. Yeah, don't let anything sneak up on you. This course is a little bit backloaded in how, because we have a final, a quiz, and a paper all due in the next couple weeks. Just stay on top of it. And if you have any questions or if I can help you in any way, don't hesitate to let me know. Many of you have taken me up on that already, which is great. Keep sending the emails. I will get back to them as fast as I possibly can. And yeah, so yeah, we're almost there. So today, I want to talk about equality, race and homosexuality specifically as our jumping off points for talking about equality. Next week, the last week, which is hard to fathom in terms of what I'm doing in notes and lectures, talking about community in general. So equality this week, equality amongst individuals, and then how that relates into a broader sense of community next week. So we talk about equality. And this is the section where we really start to talk about, we started talking about modern issues with week 13, talking about science and Francis Collins and how reason and really the modern world with its focus on reason and individualism, how that coincides with traditional Christian faith and doctrine. We're going to see just concrete examples of that, particularly this week, because the focus this week is two hot button issues even today, and issues that Christianity has had a lot of interesting dialogue concerning, race and homosexuality. But the central question is, how do Christians see the role of the church in solving modern problems? Can the church, especially in its relation to the state's role in solving modern problems? Because no one denies that these problems exist. I mean, well, most folks won't deny that really big problems exist. And this goes beyond race and homosexuality, by the way. We can talk about the environment. We can talk about all sorts of different issues. No one denies that they exist, but the question is, how do you solve them? And the modern American Christian in particular wants to say that these are heart problems. They must be solved through working in the hearts and wills of individuals, whereas more progressive, let me frame that a different way. Christianity, as it's often presented in America today, wants to frame it in terms of individual hearts and wills. This is definitely, this is in some ways residue from evangelicalism, which is very focused on the salvation of the individual. But it wants to say you're not going to solve these social problems until you get into the hearts, minds, and wills of individual people. Whereas maybe people coming from a different place or a different strain of more progressive in their political thinking want to say that, you know what, it's not going to be the 1 + 1 + 1, like change one heart and mind over here and then one over here and one over here. That's not going to work. You need to go from the top down. You need to compel a certain type of habit, a certain type of behavior, and then the hearts and wills will follow. That's basically the thrust of the discussion question this week, the quote from Martin Luther King Jr. But that is a big problem. That's a big question. Does the church want to get involved in working with these top-down, state-driven solutions to these issues, or does the church want to be living in the realm of individual souls? And hopefully that if you add enough individual souls together, you inspire collective political action, which results in a better world. So yeah, these are all really complicated issues. And let me just stress right from the front, it's impossible to say the Christian approach on X is when it comes to these things. Take homosexuality, for example. There is no Christian approach. There are Christians who are traditionalists who point to texts in the Bible that we're going to talk about and say this precludes homosexual behavior. Obviously, evangelicals, conservatives, Southern Baptists, that type, conservative Catholics. There are also Christians who will argue very differently from those same texts, more mainline, progressive, Methodist, Episcopalian, that type of thing. So there are going to be a lot of different, all under the banner of Christian, a wide spectrum of positions on the issue. And I haven't even started to talk about side B yet, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. Same with race, same with a lot of these other issues. So it's very, very hard to talk about the quote-unquote Christian position for any of these. So what I want to do instead is just kind of, with my theme for this entire class, give as many different perspectives as I can. But first of all, let's talk about race and ethnicity and talk about the biblical foundations of any type of ethic. Because this is, within the realm of, with Christians talking to Christians, this is often the starting point. So you start with the ideal. There are a couple of passages, in particular, something like Genesis 1, which talks about the image of God, all human beings created in the image of God. That's a foundational, text for equality, because all human beings, without qualification, without caveat, are created in the image of God in the Imago Dei. Then that's a powerful argument for equality right there. So you have that passage. There's another famous passage from Paul in Galatians 3, where it says, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, nor slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So another kind of big, soaring, inspiring thing where it says all of these artificial divisions have been melted away in Christ Jesus. You are one body, you are united, and all of the members are, they're distinct. You go read 1 Corinthians 12, for example. The members are distinct, but they are equal in terms of what they bring to the table and their worth. There's a powerful statement to be made from some biblical passages of utter dignity and equality. There's an ideal. But there are also biblical passages that reflect the reality of a stratified society. 1 Corinthians 7, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. Paul gets a lot of flack for not coming out harder against slavery. I don't think that's entirely fair. I think if you read something like Philemon in particular, that's a very interesting argument on slavery there. And Paul is subtle, but at the same time, he is arguing that, he is making the argument that, owning other people is not the biblical ideal, not something that Christians ought to be engaging in. Although when Paul was writing, it must be said that by far more Christians were the ones being owned than owning. When you are the countercurrent, when you are a despised minority, and most of your members are poor, you're not going to be in the position to own people so much. But a few of them were, and Philemon was one of them. And I almost asked you to read Philemon in preparation for today. Decided to hold off, but if you got some time, it's only one chapter. It's short, but it is really, really interesting for getting a take on Paul and slavery. Anyway, 1 Corinthians 7 is another Pauline passage where he appears to tell the slave, if you're a slave, don't let it get you down, and don't really just, don't strive for freedom. I'm certainly not going to strive for your freedom. Try to be the best Christian you can in the station that you're in. So that's, he gets flack for that. Romans 13 is another kind of submissive passage. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. So again, not really being revolutionary in any sense, but more saying you have been called to a deeper identity, a deeper community. Don't let the earthly stuff trouble you so much. So you have those passages. You have the ideal of absolute equality and dignity and worth. And then you also have Paul dialoguing with the reality of a first century world and what that looked like and what it looked like under the Roman authority. The tension between these two ideals, or the tension between these two spectrums, like the ideal and the reality, has always been present. I mean, we saw it with Martin Luther and Thomas Müntzer. Müntzer read Luther and said, hey, this means that we are all... Müntzer read Luther with an eye on Galatians 3, saying, you know what, we are all equal. Why do we have to respond to popes? And why do we have to really pay attention to wealthy landowners? We peasants are equal to them in the eyes of God. That the political realities ought to reflect that. Luther was, obviously horrified by this, told the nobles to stab, smite, slay, and so on. Um, so you always have these tensions. Jefferson, Washington, they use a lot of language that is kind of a combination between biblical language and Enlightenment philosopher. Basically, St. Paul and John Locke in a lot of ways. So they write these beautiful words of equality that have biblical overtones to them, but at the same time, they owned people. And Jefferson, in particular, has a really sordid past in his relationship with the slaves that he owned, particularly the female slaves that he owned. So it's complicated, I guess, is the shorthand for all of this. And that seems like a cop-out, but it really is complicated. Enter Martin Luther King. You've probably read Letter from Birmingham Jail already, but if you haven't, you need to, which is one of the reasons I assigned it. It is, what can you say about Letter from Birmingham? It's one of the pinnacles of 20th century Christian thought. It's one of the pinnacles of modern Christianity, I would argue, in a lot of ways, because of the gravity of, and never mind its importance in terms of the civil rights movement as well. Written to a group of white pastors who accused King of moving too fast and wanting too much too quickly. He was writing to pastors. He was writing to clergy. He was writing to clergy that were looking at him saying, racial equality will come. You're probably right. But the way in which you are trying to pursue your goals is disruptive and harmful, and you should really rein it in. You should not want equality so quickly. You should just kind of let it come on its own time. Because in the meantime, you're kind of stirring things up and being disruptive. And King is looking at that going, no, absolutely not. You can't stand idly by and preach your sermons and say, I'm a good Christian, if you don't care about the abject suffering that the American Negro is going through, to use King's language. He says, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one indirectly affects all indirectly. So you can't live in a bubble. You can't live in your white church bubble and just assume that everything is great because it doesn't affect you directly. You need to step outside of your zone a little bit and view what life looks like for African Americans who are trying to gain equality under the law. And if you were to do that, then you would act differently. You would not advise me to slow down. So there's this whole thing of interconnectedness of, you can't, what does, Christian teach, there's passages in Scripture and Christian teachers are going to talk about the neighbor and the responsibility to the neighbor. This is kind of what King's appealing to here. He's like, you can't ignore the suffering of your neighbor, particularly your Christian neighbor, and assume that everything is great and assume that you can be a Christian that doesn't pay any attention to this issue. You need to engage. You need to care. King goes into, he starts with that point, talks about the two kingdoms, because one of the things that the white clergy really were appalled by was that MLK was willing to break the law, was willing to go to jail. How could a Christian minister willingly break the law, willingly go to jail, and inspire others to do the same? The way in which MLK deals with this is, there's different laws. And MLK he must break the laws of one kingdom to uphold the laws of the other. This is a very old idea that he's appealing to. This is not something he just made up. He is appealing to a very old strain in Christian theology. I'll quote him again. The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. He goes on to say, all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it's morally wrong and sinful. So this, again, he quotes Augustine directly. It's also a very overt reference to Aquinas and the natural law. Aquinas was one of the, even Augustine and Aquinas were making references to these different types of laws and how do you, and this goes back even farther, by the way. Aristotle was talking about this, how there is a code of conduct which transcends earthly rules and laws. But Augustine and Aquinas put a Christian spin on it. They say, look, there is earthly laws that kings make. We read Romans 13, they need to be respected. But at the same time, there's a higher law which must be obeyed. And it is a law that appeals to, that transcends the earthly law. And if the earthly law wants to stand in the way of the natural law, of the way things really are, and in King's mind, how are things really are? Well, everybody has the image of God in them. That's the way things are. So if there's an earthly law which stands in the way, then that law can't be obeyed. Because in obeying the one, you are violating the other. And if you had to choose, it is better for you, King argues, to break earthly laws in order to uphold heavenly laws. So there is kind of this give and take of when the laws line up, great, it's easy, obey the law. But when they don't, you need to focus on the higher law, even if that puts you at odds with the lower law. Again, this is Aquinas, this is Augustine, but this is Martin Luther, but it's also the pillar that King builds a lot of his argument on. And he says, look, this isn't just me. The church has a long history of this type of behavior. Cites all types of examples. There's a very famous passage here. He gets called a Christian. He gets called an extremist, and he says at first that bothered him. But I'll read this quote. But as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a bit of satisfaction from being considered an extremist. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the gospel of Jesus Christ? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? Author of Pilgrim's Progress, by the way. I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a mockery of my conscience. Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? This nation cannot survive half slave and half free. Was not Thomas Jefferson an extremist? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice, or will we be extremists for the cause of justice? So, again, extremism in the form of breaking laws might be the only way to really honor the human dignity that King argues has been inbuilt from the beginning with all human beings being built, created in the image of God. That passage in Genesis 1 is extremely important. It is the beginning for all human rights conversations. It is the beginning of, it is the foundation for, in a lot of ways, it's the foundation for the whole concept of human rights. Because why does the individual person matter? Especially if they go against the collective. It matters because they too have been created in the image of God. All have been created in the image of God. And as a result, there is an inherent dignity which must be offered to all. So it's a phenomenal passage, and King is using it very, very well. So this is the argument he wants to make, and then he kind of goes back to the central question of what does Christianity contribute to political questions? Is it part of the disease or the cure? Quoting him again, in the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churches stand on the sidelines and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I've heard so many ministers say those are social issues which the gospel has nothing to do with. And I have watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion which made a strange distinction between bodies and souls, the sacred and the secular. So again, you have King here wants to make a more holistic argument where it's like it's not just souls. It can't be divorced from the condition of the body. The whole famous line, which for the Christian, which is more important, to save souls or to feed the hungry? For King, that's a false question. It's like do you pay more attention to the bodily, physical realities or the soul and the spiritual? King's basic answer is yes. So that you have that. Then he transitions into, well, I'm sorry, we're going to transition into today, into the modern day period. I gave you that Emma Green article to read. I think it's really interesting because the Southern Baptist Convention is a very interesting test case. Southern Baptist Convention, as the article points out, was founded on slavery, on support of slavery. That is the beginning of the Southern Baptist denomination, one of the largest denominations in the country, 16 million members, something along those lines. Founded on the support of slavery, it truly was. Back in the mid-90s, made a public repentance for its overt and sometimes implicit support of slavery through the previous centuries. But again, still wrestling with this tension. And the central figure of the article is a man named Russell Moore, who is wrestling with this tension of, can racism really be handled by laws and regulations? Isn't it at its core a sin issue? Are the solutions here political or personal? Same questions as before. And the article brings up a lot of interesting theological bits, including the role of the Bible in this conversation, individualism versus communalism, justice. But they all kind of lead back to this central question of what is the Christian responsibility in dealing with these political issues? Is it to just preach to the soul, set apart from the body, and is it just to preach to the individual, set apart from the community? Or is there a more holistic approach which needs to happen? There's a whole, it's an offshoot of the larger conversation of American religion and politics, which is a fascinating conversation. I wish I had time for it, but I just don't. But yeah, it's really, really fascinating stuff. So yeah, at the core of these, of this question on race is the idea of, can you solve the problem of racism through political means, or is it a case where you're just working on individual hearts and minds? And then, speaking of equality issues, if all people are created in the image of God, does that extend into the homosexuality conversation? And again, not all Christians react to this issue the same way. So in talking about the homosexuality issue, again, I want to start with the biblical texts that get fought over. And again, Genesis 1:27 is the beginning of it. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. The traditionalist looks at this and says, see, male and female. That's how it's supposed to work. Obviously, the proponent of same-sex marriage is going to take that person in a different direction. Leviticus 18:22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. It's pretty straightforward. But again, there is more going on there in terms of arguments. If you want to look to Jesus' take on this, there's not going to be an overt. Jesus didn't have a lot to say about homosexuality, and a lot of that had to do with the context that he was in. He was speaking most times to conservative Jews and Pharisees who this was a settled issue. They read Leviticus 18 and said, done. There's no dialogue that needs to happen on this issue. And Jesus does not engage them. Whereas Paul, who's in a first century Greco-Roman world, not talking to Jews nearly as often, he's talking to Gentiles. It's more of a live issue that needs to be addressed and discussed. And Paul is more than willing to do that, as we'll see. But anyway, if you're looking for Jesus' take, it's hard to find one directly. He does talk about, the closest he comes is talking about divorce and marriage in Mark 10. Some Pharisees came and to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? He answered them, what did Moses command you? They said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her. But Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. From the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So, hearkening back to Genesis 1. For that reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So again, you have this connection to Genesis 1. You have the traditionalist wants to look at this and say, look, father and mother, male and female. What's the issue here? And then you have Paul, Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6. I won't read the text. You have them there in front of you. But these are the starting points. And so the first position to talk about within Christianity, generally speaking, is the traditionalist position. And I gave you an article from Tim Keller, who's a pastor in New York City, author, guru of evangelicals in a lot of ways, to represent the traditionalist position. And the traditionalist position goes like this. The Bible forbids all same-sex relationships. They point to these texts and say, it's out. since Paul picks up the thread of Leviticus, we can't just dismiss prohibitions against same-sex relationships as obsolete. So in other words, people look at that Leviticus passage and say, all right, that passage is right next to the one where it says I can't make a shirt with different types of fabric. I think these commandments are a bit obsolete, don't you? Keller answers that by saying, well, Paul picks up the thread, and it's a thread that continues into the New Testament, which means it has been held over from the Old Testament, and we can't just dismiss it as obsolete. Traditionalists argue that those who push for same-sex relationships are of a piece with those who push for a dismantling of all institutional norms. They put personal autonomy above everything else. And finally, he argues that male and female have unique, non-interchangeable glories. They each see and do things that the other cannot. Sex was created by God to be a way to mingle these strengths and glories within a lifelong covenant of marriage. Homosexuality does not honor the need for this rich diversity of perspective and gendered humanity in sexual relationships. Same-sex relationships not only cannot provide this for each spouse, they can provide children with a deep connection to each half of humanity through a parent of each gender. So in other words, there is an idealist position here. This is what sex is supposed to be. This is what marriage is supposed to be. God has arranged it a certain way. And same-sex relationships are deviants against that ideal vision. This is the traditionalist position. So then you have the pro-same-sex relationships position. I gave you Matthew Vines' response to Tim Keller's article. There's also a lot of other. Rachel Held Evans is another significant proponent of same-sex relationships. Generally speaking, of course there's deviations, but generally speaking, they argue for committed, monogamous same-sex relationships. They speak at length about the pain and suffering brought on by oppression and discrimination. If same-sex I'm quoting Rachel Held Evans here, if same-sex relationships are really sinful, then why do they so often produce good fruit, loving families, open homes, self-sacrifice, commitment, faithfulness, joy? And if conservative Christians are really right in their response to same-sex relationships, then why does that response often produce bad fruit, secrets, shame, depression, loneliness, broken families, and fear? In other words, you're saying that same-sex relationships is a bad thing, but it's responsible for a lot of good things, and you're saying the traditionalist position is a good thing, but it's responsible for a lot of bad things. How does that work? They argue that the Bible warns against excessive and exploitative same-sex relationships, but not same-sex relationships in general, and certainly not healthy, committed ones. Quoting Vines, my point here is not that Paul was anything other than negative towards same-sex relations, but that lifelong monogamous same-sex marriages today are substantially different from the lustful same-sex behavior Paul had in view in Romans 1, 26 and 27. They further argue that same-sex prohibitions are evidence of a culture where strict hierarchical lines ruled the day. In other words, it's just something that is built into the culture. It's not something that God has proclaimed as bad or indecent. It's just something that was culturally proclaimed as such and therefore was just accepted. Finally, they argue that same-sex relation is core to who we are as human beings made in God's image. This is important because it's going to identify being gay as a fundamental aspect of identity and something that was not just a conscious choice so much as it was woven into the fabric of who this person is as an individual. So it's basically, how can you say that God got me wrong when he made me gay? So you have the traditionalist position, which is Keller's representative here. I gave you Matthew Vines as a representative for the pro same-sex relation, and pro in the sense of marriages and physical expression of those relationships. There's also a third way. I gave you something by Wesley Hill, and Wesley Hill is a proponent and a representative of what has been called Side B Christianity. He writes for Spiritual Friendship. But if Side A is the Matthew Vines position, full acceptance of same-sex relationships, including physical intimacy and marriage, traditional is Keller's position, then Side B Christians are kind of stuck in the middle. Side B Christians note that what the traditionalists ask the same-sex person to do, maintain celibacy outside of a web of friendships and relationships in the church body, is impossible. So Side B Christians are willing to accept same-sex attraction and same-sex orientation. They are willing to say, God made me gay. They're not willing to say it's just merely a choice that was made. So they accept that same-sex attraction exists. But at the same time, they're not willing to act on it in terms of physical intimacy or marriage. They argue that it misses the mark of God's designs for marriage and bodies while still having a great amount of good. So in other words, it's a hell of a tough position to be in, because it is accepting that same-sex attraction and orientation exists. And in some cases, in a lot of cases, it is willing to call yourself gay. Many side B Christians are willing to call themselves gay. But at the same time, they're not willing to engage in that. They're not willing to have that lead to physical intimacy or marriage. So it's almost, in some ways, it has to feel like you're fighting against yourself in some way. So it's difficult. It's not easy. So quoting him here, side B, gay Christians are by definition committed to remaining celibate, while those on side A can date and marry. LGBTQ people on side A also tend to fit reasonably well inside the secular LGBTQ community. B-siders, on the other hand, can be a pretty isolated lot. While they may have friends who are secular and devout, gay, straight, and bi, they remain on the fringes in both the Christian and the LGBTQ world. So the solution, or at least the way forward for side B Christians, is hinted at in that paragraph. It's celibacy, which is, in today's culture, is hard to fathom, no matter if you're same-sex oriented or not. But the point that last excerpt makes is that their position puts them, traditionalist Christians are going to look at them with a little bit of skepticism because they're willing to call themselves gay. Secular LGBTQ folks are going to look at them as they're going to look at them as self-haters because they're not willing to express their gayness to its fullest. So it's a difficult position to be in. But it is celibacy. Now, the reason that Hill is writing for something called spiritual friendship, it gives a clue in terms of how to deal with this difficult position. They argue that celibacy does not equal loneliness, but there's an importance of friendship. There needs to be, friendship is, for side B, the concept of friendship and the idea of friendship and the practice of friendship, platonic friendship, is extremely important, because otherwise how are you going to make it through? But there is a sense of you can get the same emotional intimacy, the same social intimacies in friendship, just without the physical components. Now, no matter what you think about it, it is significant enough that I wanted to make you aware of it, and Wesley Hill is probably the foremost proponent of it, which is the reason I gave you that piece to read. One thing that they do agree with the Matthew Vines and the Rachel Held Evans position is that homophobia in traditional Christian communities has been a major problem. Where generally traditionalist position, it's been nearly impossible to argue that this is an argument that has been made in love in most cases. It's been made in fear, disgust, and revulsion in most cases. I've seen this personally. There are stories of people who have invited invited gay friends to church, only to have the pastor get up and rail about how God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, and just completely dehumanize this entire community of people. How do you deal with that? The traditionalist, I don't think anyone can say the traditionalist Christian community has handled this position well. It has not handled itself well. But what the Tim Kellers of the world want to say is that may be true, but it doesn't change the rightness of our position. So it's interesting. There's so many issues that are affected by this. How you read the Bible, how you deal with loneliness, the nature of the church, so many things in play. The one thing that I would say is that these issues, obviously, I come at this as a practitioner, as someone who is willing to claim the identity of Christian for myself. What I would most hope for is that there would be the ability to disagree well. I don't see it, and I'm guessing you don't see it much either. If you're on social media, just with anything political or anything, any type of conversations that might be the least bit contentious, we're not very good at disagreeing well. We tend to disagree poorly and go into personal attacks and just not even attempt to engage the other person where they are. What I would like to see is not so much agreement on all of these things, because I don't think you're ever going to see it, quite frankly. What I would rather see is the ability to disagree well. So that's my hope. That's what I would like to see. But anyway, two common issues, modern issues, still hot button issues, but still connecting back to this idea of equality. What does it mean? what does equality mean? What does it mean in terms of identity? What does it mean in terms of practice? Are there practices which exclude equality? All interesting, but I've gone over my time, so I'm going to cut it off there. If you have any questions or if you want just to go deeper into some of these texts, let me know. I'll be more than happy to help. Otherwise, yeah, have a great week, and I will talk to you again next week.